Travel 300 miles northeast from the southern tip of South America, and you'll find the Falkland Islands, or Islas Malvinas. Zooming in reveals an archipelago of East and West Falkland and 200 smaller islands, covering 4,700 square miles, roughly the size of Connecticut. But despite that massive physical footprint, the civilian population is incredibly sparse. Only about 3,000 permanent residents live here. And the way those residents are distributed is highly concentrated. 4/5 of the entire population lives in a single settlement, the capital town of Stanley, built with distinctively British architecture and classic red telephone booths. Step outside the capital, and the remaining few hundred people are scattered across vast distances in highly isolated sheep farming communities. This extreme geographic isolation and tightly packed population means this society couldn't just import a standard way of life. They had to adapt specifically to this environment to survive and eventually govern themselves. If the outside world knows about the Falklands, it is almost entirely because of a brief, intense military conflict in the late 20th century. But the real driving force behind the history of these islands has always been the physical reality of the land itself. The severe climate here dictated a highly restrictive ecology. That ecology forced the settlers into a specific economic model, and eventually the wealth generated by that economy funded their modern political autonomy. If we want to understand the modern legal battles over who actually owns this territory, we need to examine how this ecosystem operates from the bedrock up. Sovereignty down here is the byproduct of a population figuring out how to master an incredibly hostile biome. This topographical cross-section reveals coastal edges fractured by deep harbors and northern hills rising to 2,312 feet. Across those hills, westerly winds average 19 miles per hour without seasonal shifts. The relentless temperature fluctuates in a narrow band, averaging between 37 and 49 degrees. When you combine that constant wind shear with those consistently low temperatures, it completely prevents the natural growth of trees. Instead, the flora is incredibly low and dense. Resilient vegetation like whitegrass and the shrub known as diddledee completely dominate the landscape. This chilly, consistently damp climate triggers a major chemical bottleneck. Plant matter here cannot completely decompose. Because the organic material breaks down so slowly, it compresses over centuries, filling the broad river valleys with massive, deep deposits of peat. This highly acidic, peat-heavy soil establishes a rigid carrying capacity. Traditional agriculture was off the table from day one. The native fauna reflects these limitations. There are no indigenous land mammals left, but the surrounding marine food web is incredibly rich. The coasts act as a major breeding ground for millions of seabirds, including vast colonies of rockhopper, Magellanic, and gentoo penguins. To build an agrarian society in a place with no native grazing mammals and endless tracts of hardy white grass, early settlers imported the one animal perfectly engineered for it, the sheep. This adaptation scaled massively. Local ranches, known as sheep stations, keep hundreds of thousands of sheep here, generating thousands of tons of wool every year. That raw wool is shipped directly to Great Britain, cementing it as the island's leading land-based export for well over a century. The capital required to run this at scale largely came from one corporate entity, the Falkland Islands Company, which received a royal charter in 1851. For many years, this London-based company was the single largest sheep rancher in the territory, essentially operating a monopoly over the local economy. The harsh biological reality forced the creation of a monocultural, corporate-owned economy. That system defined life in the Falklands for its entire first century. But in the late 20th century, the local government made a deliberate policy shift. They started breaking up that corporate dominance, encouraging smaller, locally operated family farms to take over the land. This chart shows the shift in government revenue. In 1987, the government made a crucial decision to look past the grasslands and monetize their marine ecosystem by selling fishing licenses to foreign fleets. The surrounding waters hold abundant squid populations. Charging foreign vessels for the right to harvest became a massive, highly lucrative new revenue stream.
With that capital influx, they continued diversifying. By the 1990s, seismic studies pointed to offshore oil reserves, leading to exploration licenses for foreign companies. Even the harsh ecology itself became an asset. a rapidly growing ecotourism sector began drawing international visitors eager to observe the massive, untouched penguin colonies. And the traditional sheep industry evolved as well. In 2002, a slaughter facility was constructed, allowing the islands to export high-value sheep and lamb meat to the UK, rather than just raw wool. This aggressive economic diversification successfully broke the old corporate dependency, providing the islands with the vast financial capital necessary to run a modern, self-sustaining society. Once the population controlled its own wealth, it demanded greater control over its own laws. This flowchart illustrates the 2009 Constitution, which decentralized power from London. Authority technically rests with the Crown, but the appointed governor must consult a local executive council. Lawmaking happens in the Legislative Assembly, where 8 of 10 members are directly elected by islanders. What makes this legislature highly unusual is the complete absence of political parties. Every single member is elected as an independent. There is one major restriction on local autonomy: defense. The governor must consult the British military's regional commander regarding internal security and external threats. The result is a highly functional, entirely self-funded microdemocracy. They rely on the British Crown for military protection, but they pay for their own existence. Despite this stable, self-sufficient internal government, the entire territory sits on a geopolitical fault line created centuries ago. Look at the timeline of early settlement. It is completely fractured. The French established the first colony in 1764, naming them the Malvinas. The British settled West Falkland in 1765. Then the Spanish bought out the French and violently drove the British off in 1770. The timeline finally stabilizes in 1833. A British military force arrived, expelled the few remaining officials from the newly independent government of Argentina without firing a single shot, and initiated a continuous, self-supporting British civilian occupation. That status quo held until after World War II. In 1964, Argentina bases its claim on rigid territorial inheritance. They argue that the island's physical proximity to South America, combined with the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, gave Spain ownership, which legally transferred to Argentina upon their independence. Britain's counterargument rests entirely on continuous, effective administrative possession and occupation of the territory since 1833. But the core pillar of the British defense is not historical, it is demographic. They cite the United Nations Charter itself, arguing that the islanders have a fundamental right to self-determination, and that forcing them under Argentine rule against their will would actively create a colonial situation, not resolve one. The United Nations was presented with an unresolvable contradiction, a clash between the ancient laws of territorial inheritance and the modern right of an existing population to govern itself. Years of UN resolutions and diplomatic discussions produced nothing. And on April 2, 1982, Argentina's military government abruptly invaded. This triggered the Falkland Islands War. It lasted just 10 weeks, ending with the surrender of Argentine forces at Stanley to the British troops who fought their way back onto the islands. While both nations formally restored full diplomatic relations in 1990, the core disagreement regarding sovereignty did not change. The local population realized they were the strongest variable in this equation. In 2013, they held a referendum to legally and publicly state their own choice. The islanders voted nearly unanimously to remain a British overseas territory, exercising their right to determine their own political status. The Falkland Islands are a completely self-determining system. The harsh, restrictive geography of the South Atlantic demanded immense physical and economic adaptation from anyone who settled here. Over generations, those adaptations forged a highly diversified, unyielding society that has earned the right to write its own future.